Okay, welcome everyone to today's podcast episode here at Class. We are going to talk today about revenue cycle and specifically prior authorization. I'm Kyle Chilton, Senior Insights Director here at Class, joined by Dustin Cragun, Vice President over Revenue Cycle, Software and Services. So Dustin, there's a lot going on with revenue cycle and healthcare. I mean, there always is, but there seems to be a lot of energy around it right now. What are some of the things providers are facing in that space?
Yeah, good question. So I don't think the challenges are new.
Sure.
It's the same challenges that they've been facing for years and years. So it's always going to be maximizing collections so they can certainly pay the bills, decreasing the cost to collect in providing that, or going through that process. And then we're just, in healthcare, we're really faced with this staffing challenges. So we don't have enough labor to really do a lot of this work. And then the labor that we do have are often burned out and just taxed with a lot of these manual processes that become burdensome and kind of weigh on that department. So again, I think these are things that they've been facing for quite some time, but it definitely feels like it's been exacerbated probably from the pandemic.
Right.
So that's what we're seeing now.
So you talk about like manual processes and burnout. Like, it seems like prior authorization is a topic that comes up a lot in kind of those topics specifically.
Yeah.
Kind of maybe walk me through like what prior authorization is and like what are some of the issues we're seeing there?
Yep. Prior authorization has been around for a long time. Almost every provider has to deal with it.
Right.
You know, the payers use it as a utilization management tool to ensure that what they're paying for is really needed. The I guess downstream effect to that is that the providers are faced with understanding, okay, what services need to have a prior authorization done, and then actually going through that process of getting a prior authorization can be, well, you know, years ago it was very manual process driven, and we're looking at now tools that are automating that. But that can be a very time consuming and a very labor intensive process to do that for all of the services and clinical interventions that are happening that need a prior auth.
And there's always changes happening within that too, right? Payers deciding what they will and won't pay for and like...
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the bigger challenges with the prior authorization is when you look at all the different health plans that are associated with each of those payers, and they have their own rules and they have their own regulations, and those are constantly being updated. So not only do you have to get your hands around what is required, which services need a prior auth and how that's to be done, you have to do that for every plan, and then to have them constantly changing underneath you. Like staying on top of that is actually one of the biggest challenges associated with doing a successful prior authorization.
There's a lot to keep lot to keep track of. It sounds like, obviously, and with staffing issues as it is, that just makes it that much harder. So we've talked. You know, we know what prior authorization is, but like, what are other tools that can help, like, make this, I guess, easier or less time intensive?
So anytime you can automate any manual process, you're going to do that for all the reasons that I guess the opposite reasons we talked about, that the providers are challenged with costs and with staffing issues. You know, it alleviates those, it reduces costs, and it provides a better working environment for staffing. You don't need as much staff to do that. So vendors, HIT vendors, are looking at providing these solutions that are electronic, so they don't require near as much manual intervention, and that they're happening of course, automatically. And so we have seen a total upswell of vendors that are getting into this space, which is good.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the more vendors that come into this space and help offer solutions, good solutions, the better off for the providers. So now is a great time for providers to be looking at those solutions, but there's still some challenges associated with it.
It seems like you talked about some of the general challenges of, you know, all the different payers and plans you got to keep track of, and the changes are like, it seems like even with a technology that can help you, you know, process claims and everything, there's still going to be challenges of keeping track of all that and making sure the tech you have can keep up with that.
It's interesting. One of the things about prior authorization that I don't think most people realize is it's not just a single transaction. It would be great if you just kind of had to do one thing, but prior authorization is really like 3 or 4 different things. You know, the first part is really, we talked about with the payers and understanding their rules and regulations. So determining what procedures actually need that prior authorization and communicating that back to the provider so they know that they need to chase that. It's kind of incredulous to think, though, that there are times that providers have actually been trying to get a prior authorization for a clinical service or intervention that was not needed, but they had no way of knowing if they needed it or not, so they erred on the side of, well, I better do this, because if I don't and it gets denied, then we're not going to get paid for that claim.
And the patient's going to be out, and just going to be problems for everybody. Yeah.
Problems for everybody. Yeah. So that's a big first step, in this process. Then the second piece of the prior authorization, electronic prior authorization, is actually submitting the authorization with the appropriate information to the payer, so that they can make a determination of that. Mm-hmm. And then the third piece is being able to status that prior authorization. Was it approved? What is the approval numbers, and being able to take that and get it back into the EHR, so you have that for record. And so, finding vendors and having that technology that can work through each of those really disparate processes of the prior authorization has been a challenge as well.
So there's a lot of players in the market, like you mentioned. What are we seeing as class in the market in prior authorization?
Probably a complex answer. So I guess the good news first is that there are a lot of vendors that we had already mentioned that are in that space, and everyone's looking to solve that problem. So that's great for providers to give them opportunities, and we absolutely are seeing successful use cases. So we're seeing situations where providers, especially with their biggest payers or their biggest services that they're providing, that is fully automated, and it's reducing the burden on the staff. They're saving costs, and I would never say that it's something that you can kind of set it and forget it. There's always going to be that maintenance of staying on top of things, but we do get very successful use cases that when we talk to the different providers. Now, unfortunately, and like in most spaces, you always find those situations that are not as favorable. We certainly find providers that are challenged with the prior auth, and some of that is the HIT vendor they've selected. Some of it is the providers haven't put enough of their own internal resources into making this work. I think, as a side note, that's an interesting finding that or thing that providers often overlook, which is it does take effort on the provider side as well to get this up and going, and there has to be a commitment made. So I think in situations where maybe that commitment has not been made, we've at times seen situations where it has not been going well, or maybe perhaps that they feel like they're actually kind of babysitting that transaction along the way. And thinking, well, if it's an electronic authorization, shouldn't this be able to take care of itself? And here I am kind of watching this go through. It kind of defeats the purpose. And so, again, that's a story, I guess, that we could probably say in most segments that class measures are successful and unsuccessful. But it's still, in a lot of ways, an emerging area. For healthcare, this electronic prior auth. So I certainly think in time it's going to work itself out.
What would you say are the characteristics of those that maybe are the most successful in this space? Like, because you mentioned, with how much change there is it maybe more limited in scope, or those, like, what are some of maybe the trends that you see that are most successful, happiest customers?
I don't know if there's an absolute answer, but a couple of the areas that providers often provide back to class, and to no one's surprise, number one, the commitment that the vendor has to the provider to make it work. So we will hear things and comments such as, the vendor was with us every step of the way. They wouldn't let us fail. They did not stop until this worked. That kind of commitment on behalf of the vendor. So I think that's a big one. The other thing is the providers having this recognition that they have to work on this too. Right, and they have skin in the game, and so as soon as they have that recognition, then they go to work on that. Then the chances of success have gone up.
And it's not just a commitment from the beginning, but it's kind of like throughout the whole process,
for sure.
An ongoing commitment, right?
Absolutely.
Like you can't just, hey, we got it set up really good, let's go, it's plugged in and we're ready. We read the manual or whatever, but we got to check in probably daily or weekly or whatever that is to make sure that we're giving the vendor the information, and then they're doing their part to follow through.
Absolutely, and the situations do vary, but yes, that is a common theme, that it still takes ongoing work and monitoring But as things work out over time and they get more and more streamlined, that I think becomes less and less.
Yeah. Okay. So are you seeing use cases where maybe staffing is becoming, some of those staffing issues are being alleviated at least a little bit? Because I mean, obviously the staffing issues are multifaceted, right? Within healthcare, it's not just one area, but it's all over the place. But are you seeing examples where staffing maybe is, being helped? Some of those issues are being helped with these tools.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's definitely the good news. With any automation, just not even just prior authorization,
Sure.
but any automation that we see in rev cycle, what we normally see is not usually this drastic change in staffing levels because of one implemented automation. What it is usually this idea that there's enough different automations that in totality, the provider employees are feeling like, oh, my job's gotten a little easier. I have a little more breathing room here.
Freed up to do other things that will be helpful, yeah.
But I do think when you look at the amount of time that it's taken providers to manually obtain a prior authorization, this is a very big impacting area. And so I think that that's really been the good news for providers.
Good. So we've talked about, where we're at now, how, these tools they're helping certainly, and they're developing, they're growing. You called it kind of an emerging space. So with that in mind, like what's the future here? Like where do we go from where we are today to next year, the next 5 years?
Yeah. So in short, I do think the future is bright, not to be too cliche about the whole thing, but I really do see that, well, first of all, the reality is that prior authorization is not going away anytime soon. Perhaps, with value-based care, we'll see a dip in prior authorizations. But for now, I mean, they're here to stay. They're not going anywhere. And as the vendors are putting a lot of time and resources into making this work, things are bound to only get better over time.
Yeah.
I think some of the areas that we're starting to see, which should create a little optimism, is everybody recognizes the need to standardize the data, these transactions coming, the communications coming between the payers and providers and the vendors, because if everyone's kind of doing things differently, it's hard to really have this free flow of information and communication. So we're starting to even see a little bit of legislation. I think this is where legislation could actually be a good thing. Normally we don't say legislation is a great thing, but I think this is an area where if we can standardize that, as well as some of the legislation recently about how quickly that payers are required to respond back to providers, so that ultimately you don't have patients waiting for days or weeks to get a treatment because the provider hasn't been able to get the get the authorization and get that approved, right? That's a very unsettling thing as a patient. So there's a lot of positive things that are coming, and I think that we probably could use even maybe a little bit more standardization in some of those areas. But in time, those will come, as well as with enough successful use cases, we sort of learn from our own mistakes. And so I think implementations go better the more we do, those kind of things. So I see a pretty positive trajectory.
That's exciting. And it sounds like obviously the technology can always improve, the software can improve, like you said, the implementations, but it's also a bit reliant on some exterior forces like legislation and standardization. So yeah, it'll be an interesting space to watch for the next little while.
Yeah, and I would actually even just say it's more than just a little bit. I think it's I'm not sure it's a technology limitation near as much as it is sort of this coordination, speaking the same data languages and those kind of things. And so and those seem like it's something that we could address pretty easily. So it'll be really exciting, I think, in the next year to watch how things progress.
Nice. Obviously we measure a lot of vendors in this space and things like that, but what are we doing in this space? What's the future with KLAS in prior auth?
We've actively been measuring vendors, over the last, I think, 6 months. That's going to continue, and so we will collect more and more data and have a more, I think, clear picture than we have. I think we actually do have a fairly clear picture now, but more data, the data points that we have, the clearer the picture becomes. And so we'll be publishing. Some of those vendors are live on our website now. So you can go to our website and see those data points. Also, we're just wrapping up a report that should be publishing in a couple of months. It'll be a great insight as to where the market is today. And then we certainly have plans to continue capturing data going forward on the providers, or excuse me, on the vendors on behalf of the providers,
Sure.
and then publish another report, I'm sure, maybe in another 12 months to kind of see how we progressed overall.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like as you mentioned, again, a kind of an emerging space. We'll measure the vendors now, continue to measure, see how that customer experience hopefully improves or changes, and what strengths and weaknesses come out of that. So that'll be fun. That'll be exciting to see what comes out of that. Yeah, so it's exciting to see the research that we're doing and to see how vendors perform and how providers feel about the tools they're using. And yes, just thanks for joining us today on the podcast to talk about prior authorization and where we're at now, where we're going. We're excited to see where that research takes us. So
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us, and be sure to tune in for future podcast episodes as we look at the emerging technology in healthcare and what's happening there. So thanks again, and tune in the future.